Welcome to this lecture on evolutionary biology. Today, we are going to explore a fascinating and crucial concept known as the selection coefficient. If you have ever wondered exactly how scientists measure the harsh realities of survival of the fittest, you are in the right place. We will build this concept from the ground up. So, let us dive right in. To begin our journey, I want you to imagine you are watching a marathon. In this race, some runners are forced to wear heavy backpacks, while others get to run freely. Naturally, the runners without the backpacks have a massive advantage and are much more likely to win. In the wild, animals and plants face a very similar race for survival and reproduction. Certain genetic traits act exactly like those heavy backpacks. They might make an organism slightly slower, slightly more visible to predators, or perhaps slightly less attractive to potential mates. This evolutionary disadvantage is exactly what we want to measure. Now that we have that picture in our minds, let us define what the selection coefficient actually is. The selection coefficient is the mathematical tool biologists use to measure exactly how heavy that genetic backpack is. It is a formal, numerical measure of the strength of natural selection acting against a specific genotype or phenotype. It tells us precisely how much of a disadvantage a specific trait gives an organism compared to the best adapted members of its population. If a genotype is perfectly fit, there is no evolutionary pressure acting against it. But if it has a flaw, the selection coefficient captures that penalty. This brings us to an important question. Why do we care so much about measuring this specific number? Without the selection coefficient, evolutionary biologists would only be able to say that a trait is generally bad or good. That is simply not precise enough to make scientific predictions. By calculating the exact value, scientists can predict exactly how many generations it will take for a harmful genetic disease to disappear from a population. In the real world, this is incredibly important in medicine, where doctors use it to understand how quickly bacteria are evolving resistance to antibiotics. It is also vital in conservation biology to save endangered species. Before we can calculate the selection coefficient, we must first understand its direct relationship with another foundational concept called relative fitness. Relative fitness measures how well a specific genotype survives and reproduces compared to the absolute best genotype in the population. To set a baseline, we look at the most successful, or most fit individuals in a population. We assign them a maximum relative fitness score of exactly 1. Any other, less successful genotype will have a relative fitness score somewhere between 0 and 1. This score is the stepping stone we need to find our evolutionary disadvantage. Now that we understand relative fitness, let us look at the mathematical formula that connects these ideas. The relationship is beautifully simple. The formula is S equals 1 minus W. Conceptually, this formula compares the perfect baseline to the actual performance of our organism. The symbol S represents the selection coefficient, which is the evolutionary disadvantage we are trying to find. The symbol W represents the relative fitness of the specific genotype we are studying. The number 1 represents the relative fitness of the most successful genotype in the entire population. When the relative fitness W decreases, meaning the organism is doing poorly, the selection coefficient S increases. This shows that natural selection is pushing hard against that trait. With our formula in hand, let us see this with a concrete example involving a real population of beetles. Suppose the green beetles are perfectly camouflaged and produce an average of 100 surviving offspring. The brown beetles stand out to birds and only produce an average of 80 surviving offspring. We want to find the selection coefficient for the brown beetles. First, we find their relative fitness by dividing their 80 offspring by the 100 offspring of the green beetles. This gives a relative fitness W of 0.80. Now we plug this into our formula. S equals 1 minus 0.80. Our final answer is a selection coefficient of 0.20. This means the brown beetles suffer a 20% reproductive disadvantage. To make this result perfectly clear, let us look at a visual representation of what we just calculated. On the screen, you see a bar chart where the vertical axis represents relative fitness, ranging from 0 to 1. The green bar represents our perfectly adapted green beetles, reaching the maximum fitness score of 1. The brown bar represents the brown beetles, reaching only 0.8. Notice the empty space above the brown bar. That gap, highlighted by the red bracket, is exactly what the selection coefficient measures. It visually represents the 0.2 or 20% evolutionary penalty that the brown beetles pay because of their coloration. Now that we have visualized the math, let us discuss what this actually means for the beetles in the wild. A selection coefficient of 0.20 physically means that the brown beetles suffer a 20% reproductive disadvantage compared to the green beetles. Every single generation, the brown beetles are leaving behind 20% fewer offspring than their green counterparts due to bird predation. Over many generations, this 20% penalty compounds. It will cause the brown beetle trait to become increasingly rare in the population, unless other factors intervene. This shows how a simple number predicts the future of a species. Having seen a moderate disadvantage, let us consider a much more extreme scenario involving a severe genetic mutation in a population of mice. Suppose there is a dominant genetic mutation that causes a fatal heart defect before the mice are even born. Normal mice survive and produce an average of 10 offspring. The mice with the fatal mutation produce exactly 0 offspring because they do not survive to reproductive age. First, we determine their relative fitness by dividing 0 by 10, which gives us exactly 0. This makes perfect logical sense, as they cannot reproduce. We plug this 0 into our formula, S equals 1 minus 0. Our final answer is a selection coefficient of exactly 1. So we have calculated a selection coefficient of 1. What does this extreme value tell us? The result of 1 is the absolute maximum value the selection coefficient can take. It indicates that natural selection is acting with the maximum possible force against this trait, completely removing it from the gene pool in a single generation. This perfectly illustrates how lethal alleles are treated by natural selection. It acts as the ultimate evolutionary heavy backpack that prevents the organism from even entering the race. It confirms mathematically what we know intuitively. Lethal traits simply cannot persist under strong natural selection. Before we summarize, it is worth reflecting on the broader power of this metric. The selection coefficient does more than just describe the present. It bridges the gap between observation and prediction. By translating the harsh, chaotic realities of nature into precise, usable numbers, it gives biologists a window into the future. Whether we are looking at beetles in a forest or bacteria in a hospital, knowing this exact value allows us to forecast the genetic makeup of future populations. It is the fundamental key to understanding how natural selection actively shapes the incredible diversity of life on Earth over time. To wrap up our lecture, let us review the most important ideas we have covered today. First, the selection coefficient is a vital mathematical metric that quantifies the evolutionary disadvantage of a specific trait. Second, we calculate it by measuring the gap between the most fit individuals and the less fit individuals using the simple formula S equals 1 minus W. Finally, we saw that values range from 0 for perfectly fit organisms all the way to 1 for completely lethal mutations. You have now mastered the foundational math behind natural selection. Great job today!